All right, welcome back. So in this lecture, we'll be talking about data types, right? So now, what are data types? Basically a program or a system needs to store data. For example, the school system have to store your data, and maybe in the hospital needs to know about your health data, information like that. The government needs to know about your data. Any system needs data, not just a computer system, right? So now we are interested in creating a script or a program, right? So automatically we need to use data, we need to store data, we need to manipulate data, right? Means at which we store data depends on the type of data we are planning to store, right? So for example, we have different type of data. So by default, we have numbers, we have string, and we have boolean. So under the numbers, we have the integer, while we have the decimal one, which are the float and double, right? So you can see that yes, we have numbers, and the numbers, let me quickly type that out. So under the numbers, right? So you can see under the numbers, we have one, which is the integer. So these are values that are whole number or does not have any decimal. Then we have another one, which is double, right? So they are like decimal, so they have decimal values. So it is either a double or a float. So that is for numbers, right? So we also have another data type, which is boolean. So you might know what Boolean is depending on your background. So especially when you have a mathematical background. So Boolean is simply a yes or no. For example, are you above 18? Yes, I am. Are you below 18? No. Something like that. So a true or false value is Boolean. So you're expecting an answer in true or false. Are you a US citizen? Yes or no? That kind of data, So it is simply a true or false value. So you can say true or false, right? So that is for boolean. Then we have another one for string. So string is when you have a text inside a quote, right? For example, when we were trying to write, when I was trying to show you this alert, you can see that I put this in a quote. I put this information in a quote. So all of this in a quote, it is a string. So it takes in alphanumeric values. So it can take in letters, it can take in numbers, it can take in signs. For example, I can decide to add this, I can decide to add this, I can decide to add anything. It's so far it is inside this quote, it will be considered as a string. So string entertain an alphanumeric values. It can be letter, it can be numbers, it can be sign, it can even be emoji, depending on what I want. So far it is in a quote, right? So that is a string. Then we also have colors, right? So we are going to look at colors probably in the next lecture. So we have colors, right? Then we have date time. So we are going to look into this one by one for now. So then we have date time, right? So that's another one. So then we have enum, right? So basically all of these that I've listed, so the numbers, the boolean, the string, the color, the date time, and the enum, they are all called basic data type, right? So they are just basic. So if you want to go into the complex part, the complex type of data type, there we have two. So we have the structure, there we have the structure, then we have this class, right? So class. So that is it. So you can see we have structure. So this is complex data types. So you can see these are basic data types, basics. So okay, maybe I will have to increase this the size of this. Okay, let me go for this maybe I'll increase it like this. Okay, hopefully you can see we have basically two class of data types. We have the basic and we have the complex. Oops, I put complex. So we have the complex, right? So under the basic we have numbers, and under the numbers we have integers, so which are whole numbers, right? And under the other one is decimal, which are numbers with decimal points, and then we have two types, the floats and the double. And for the integer we have different type as well, we talk about in a few seconds, but I just want to let you know that these are data types. So these are the possible type of data that we can potentially store. So for the boolean we have just one boolean, and it takes in true or false. And for the string, it is anything encapsulated into a quote, an opening quote and a closing quote. So it can be numbers, it can be alphanumeric. It is alphanumeric, Then we have colors. We talk about colors later. Then we have date time. So that means it takes in a date and time. It carries the details of dates and time. Then we have a norm. We are going to talk about a norm later. Then we have complex data types, which are structures and classes, right? So now let's quickly take it. So let's take it one step at a time, right? So let's quickly start with numbers. So now, like I said, we have two type of numbers, right? We have the integer, which are whole number, and we have the double and float, which are decimal number. So for the integer, we have different type of integer. So now let me quickly clear this up. So let's declare the first one, which is char. So you can see char, right? So the moment you write this, then the next thing you need to specify is your variable name. So now, what is a variable name? So it is simple. A variable is something that varies, right? That can potentially change, that its value can potentially change. So if you have a mathematics background, so variable in mathematics is almost the same with this. So a variable, maybe a variable X, variable Y, something like that. So it can potentially change, right? So that is why it's called a variable. So you must give it a name. So you can say, okay, my variable, maybe you want to store age. So you can say age, then you end with a semicolon. So now, so this means you have a variable. You want to store age. You want to store something into this so that when you store something into this and you need that thing, all you need to do is call this variable and you'll be able to retrieve the value, right? And what type of data are you trying to store? That is what this is carrying. So we are going to talk about variables in the next lecture, but this concept cannot be explained simultaneously. That is why I have to explain it one by one. But in the case where you are finding it hard to understand, just take it easy and stay with me. By the time we go through the next lecture, everything will become clearer, and by the time we implement these things, everything will become clearer, right? Just stay with me, please. So this is the variable name, and this is the type of data type I installed to store in this variable. So for example, now that I've said, okay, I want to store char, on this variable, I cannot say this anymore. So I cannot impute a string, because I already promised that the data type I'll be assigning to this variable will be of this data type. So I have to specify maybe 2, right? Then, like I said, after storing your values in a variable, you can reuse, you can call it anywhere, right? So far it is within the scope at which you declare it, right? So just, I know that statement you might not understand, but for now, just have it at the back of your mind. So now let's quickly print out this. So I will say H, alert, then I will say H. So I will save and I'll compile. Now save. You can see I have no error. Then let's quickly launch this. Okay, let me first close this up. I'll close this up. So let me quickly run my script. So I would double click. You can see it is returning 4, right? Which is what I added. So now there's limit to this particular data type, and the limit is that there must be a maximum and a minimum value you can assign, you can store in this particular data type. So data type you are using for a particular variable means that, please, I want to store this type of data, and I promise that it won't be beyond this and it won't be lower than this. For example, for this chart, I can assign 4, but the minimum I can assign is -128. So this is the minimum value I can assign. For example, if I save and compile, I'll still be able to print this. Let's see that in action. All right, so you can see I am still able to print this, but let me go lower. Let me try to go lower. So let's try to go lower, maybe 1 minus 129. Let me save and compile. Then let's run. You can see that when I'm trying to go lower, instead of printing out the right thing for me, it's not printing out the right thing anymore because I've exceeded the minimum. So in the case where I need to store a value that is lower than this minimum for the char, so that means I need to consider using another data type, right? So let me quickly show you the maximum for this char. So now the maximum for the char is positive 127, right? So let me save and compile. You will see that in action. So I'll compile, I'll launch. You can see it's print out my value, which is 127, right? So now let me try to print out something bigger than 127, which is, once I said 127 is the maximum for char, right? So let me try to print maybe 130, save and compile. Then I will save. It is giving me a wrong value. I'm telling it that, okay, please print 128. But because by default, char have a particular size of memory it can consume. But the moment you are specifying a value that is higher than the maximum value it can consume, it can hold, and a value that is lower than the maximum, the minimum value it can hold, automatically there will be a problem. So that means if you are using char, make sure that your value is between -128 to 127, positive 127. So that is that. So you have to have this at the back of your mind that, okay, if you are sure that, okay, whatever value that will be assigned to this age won't be beyond this range, it will be within this range, then you are fine it's fine for you to use char. So now the question is, what if you are interested in using something bigger, right? Maybe you know that the value that is coming is most likely going to be maybe 130, 140, or 1400, something bigger. Then we have to consider using another data type. So now the other option that we have is short. So we have another one which is short. So we can say age, so we can specify maybe 130, 140, and that is because short takes in value from negative 32,768 to positive 32,767, right? So if, let me remove this, let me just put this comma. So that means if I specify age, for example, you remember I have commented out this. That means I'm telling the compiler that please ignore this particular line of code. So this one will be active, and for this, it will also be ignored because it is a comment. I hope you remember that. So, and in the case where you are doubting, I can easily delete it so that you can see. Temporarily, I'll just cut, then I'll save and compile. You will realize that this age will print out, this alert will print out 130 conveniently. So let me do this. Okay, you can see it is printing out 130 conveniently. So let's go back and let's try maybe 1400 and save and compile. So I'll go back. So I'll just double click. You can see it is printing it out conveniently. But what if we are trying to say it should be char? Let's see if it is going to be able to conveniently print that out. Okay, you can see it is not able to print that out. You can see, so that's another thing. So you must be sure of the values you are expecting and use your correct data type, right? So now, how do you know what is the maximum value for a particular data type? So let me quickly show you that. So what you can do, okay, let me take this back. Then I will take this back to short, right? So how do you know? What you can do is there is an identifier. We will talk about identifier when we talk about variables in details, but for now, there is an identifier, more like a default variable that when you call it, it will give you a particular value. For example, if you want the maximum number that you can store, the maximum value that you can store on this short, all you need to do is say this short, then underscore maximum, right? So you are telling me that please tell me the maximum I can store for this short. So that is what I'm trying to do. So I can save and compile, and you will see that the value will be this. And of course, you should be aware now that this is just a comment, so the compiler will ignore. So it will give me the actual value that I want. So let me run this again. You can see it is giving me this value, telling me that this is the maximum value that a short can store. So that means you can programmatically know. You do not need to memorize all of this. And if you want to know the minimum, all you need to do is say short minimum, and let me save and compile. You see it will give us this value. So let me quickly run that so that you can see. You can see that is the value it is giving us. So let me bring this. So you can see that is the value it is giving us, right? So, and in case maybe you want to know for this char, you want to know the maximum or the minimum, you can always say char maximum. So this automatically is going to return 127. Let me save and compile. All right, so you can see it is returning 127. So that means programmatically we can know what is the maximum or what is the minimum for a particular data type, right? So all you need to do is write out the data type, maybe short, then underscore the minimum or the maximum, that is it. So now, what if we want to store something that is a value that is lower than this value or a value that is higher than this value? Then we need to consider another data type. Now, what data type can we still consider? Yes, there is another data type called int. So basically integer, I know that I said the class of all of these numbers, these chars is integer. Yes, there is another one called int, basically int, So all we need to do is we can say int note. Like I said in one of our previous lectures, I said MQL4 is case sensitive. When I wrote int or when I wrote short char, I didn't start with capital letter. I didn't say char. I didn't say short. And now I'm not saying int. I'm not saying capital letter I. I said small letter I int. Then you specify the variable. So I can say age. Now, if I want to store a value that is higher than this, maybe 100,000. Oops, sorry, I shouldn't put a comma. So if I am to specify 100,000, which is higher than this, and I want to execute, so I will be able to get the value conveniently and there won't be a problem. It won't lose it in memory. So now let's launch this. Okay, you can see it prints it out conveniently because it can accommodate such value, right? So now, everything has a limit, of course. So what is the limit of this? The limit of this, how do we know? I can easily type this out, but let's quickly get the maximum and the minimum of this. Can you guess what it can be? It's simply int underscore max. And let's save and compile. Let's run it. You can see this is the maximum value int can store. The moment you start giving it value that is higher than this, it starts messing up, right? So that means you need to consider another data type. That means if you are expecting a value that is higher than that, please consider using another data type. That is what it means. So let's quickly go for the maximum. So let's see, the minimum. So let's see if we can get the minimum. Of course, it will be negative of that. So let's see, you can see that is the minimum. So if you are specifying a value that is lower than this, automatically int is no longer compatible for your mission, right? So you need to consider using something else. So what if you want to use a value that is more than this, that is beyond all of this, right? That is beyond these values. So what if, let me put the comma instead of space. So what if you want to use a value that is, that is beyond 2 billion 0.4, whatever that is beyond this, then you have to consider another data type. And what data type can you still consider? Then you can consider what is called long, right? So you can say long. Then you can, you can specify, let's give it this value, but we won't be using this, and we will remove this comma. Else we have a syntax error, So, and let's not forget our semicolon, else we have a syntax error. You know what? Instead of using 2 billion, let's use 4. So let's see if it is going to be able to entertain, if this data type will be able to entertain this value. Let's see. You can see it entertained the value. But you know what? Let's try to use int. Let's see if int can accommodate. You remember that I told you that. Remember I told you that this is the maximum that int can accommodate. Let's see if it can accommodate this. Of course, this is higher than this. This is 4 billion and this is 2 billion. So let's see if it can accommodate it. Of course, it won't be able to accommodate it. It's going to freak out. So let's see. Let me you can see it is freaking out. It's telling me that, oh, I can't accommodate this and it is messing up. So in general, in the case where you realize that the value you want to store is within this range, then you can use char as the data type for number. And in the case where you realize that, oh, the value you are expecting or the value you intend to store is within this range, then you can use short. And in the case where you know that, okay, the value you are expecting to store, is within 2 billion, this value, you can use int. And if you know that, oh, you are using something higher, something more than that, I think you should just go for long. So now the question is, why not just go for long every time? Yes, you can, but in the case where you are dealing with something sensitive of memory and you do not want to overuse your memory, be sure to use the perfect data type. Else, if you keep using maybe long every time instead of when you are expecting just short, or just char, of course you are going to be messing up with the memory. You are going to be using too much memory, and when you use too much memory, your program might become slower and you might exhaust your memory. Of course, that you don't want to do that. So instead of always having to think of what to use, and what you can do is one of the things you can use in determine what data type to use is what means are you trying to use in receiving the value. For example, if you are receiving a value given by a function, for example, maybe you are using an inbuilt function or something, and the inbuilt function returns an integer. So it's best if you just store that value, the function is returning, store it in an integer. If the value is returning a long, make sure you store the value that the function is returning, store it in a long. If the value if the function is returning a short, make a variable of a short and store the value in there. So for example, this is what I mean. Let's assume I want to store the order ticket. So if, for example, I'm sorry for bringing this up, but you realize that this is telling me that int, that is the order ticket, the value that this particular function that I'm about to call. We talk about function later in the lectures, but I just want to point this out. I'm very sorry. So since this function is going to return an integer, so that means once I get this order ticket, I should store the value in an integer, you know. So instead of saying every time I want to use long, no, 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 don't use long. You can have a hint of the perfect data type to use to store your values based on what your function is returning, So using int is sufficient. Automatically, the function is telling you that, this function has given you the hints that I won't give you a value that is more than what int can accommodate. So that's another thing. And also, you can easily think of it. For example, if you are interested in getting maybe age of somebody, you should know that, of course, an age should not be more than this. And even if it is meant to be more than this, maybe you have somebody that has been living for before Christ, so you should know that your age that you are expecting, age of somebody should not be more than this, unless maybe you are dealing with geological time. I'm sorry about that. So maybe in geology, in field like geology, age is not age like this is even is even is a very small age, is a young age. We talk about billions, we talk about millions years of age. So in case you are dealing, unless you are dealing with maybe like geological things, that you can consider using long or int. But if you are dealing with human being age, it shouldn't be more than this. And maybe just to give room for, in the case where you have somebody that is older than 127 trying to use your program, then you can consider using this. So in general, the data type that you use should be based on what you are expecting to store, and you can get int of such. Maybe you want to store a value from an inbuilt function. So now try to see what is the function returning. Is it returning an integer, a long, or a short, or a char? That will determine what data type you are meant to use, right? So that is that for numbers, right? So we also have other data type under numbers, right? So example, this char have another one called uchar, so in case where you see it later, do not be surprised. So I would like to talk about it, but for the sake of simplicity, and you most likely won't need this, we also have another one for short. So we can, you have this u short. So for the sake of simplicity, I do not want to go there, so let's just keep it to this level so that you'll be able to understand and move on conveniently. Because in fact, you most likely won't be using this short and char only on few cases, right? So the int and the long is what you most likely use often. So that is that, right? So in the next lecture, we talk about decimal, right? Then we go deeper. I'll see you in the next lecture.